My mother's house on Sycamore Drive had a porch step that creaked on the left side, a kitchen window that looked over a garden she had tended for 31 years, and green shutters that she repainted every spring without fail because she said a house that was cared for on the outside told the people inside that they were worth the effort. And I am telling you that detail first because I need you to understand what that house was before I tell you what my family did with it on the day I buried her. My name is Margaret Ellison, and my mother Eleanor passed on a Sunday morning in early April, quietly and without drama, in the bedroom she had slept in for 3 decades, with the window cracked the way she always kept it because she believed fresh air was the closest thing to free medicine. I had been with her in the final days, sleeping on the couch, making soup she could not finish, waking at every sound, while my brother, Thomas, and my sister Joanna had each visited once, briefly, with the energy of people who have somewhere else to be. I made the funeral arrangements alone on Wednesday, buried her on Friday, and stood at that graveside between Thomas and Joanna while they held me and said all the things people say at gravesides. And I believed every word, because grief does not leave room for suspicion. I drove to Sycamore Drive afterward alone, planning to spend the weekend going through her belongings with the care she deserved, and I turned onto her street and saw the green shutters from halfway down the block and felt the particular comfort of a place that has held you since before you were fully formed. And then I saw the sign planted in the front yard, and my foot came off the accelerator before my brain had issued the instruction, and I pulled forward slowly until I was close enough to read every word on it. And what I read told me that my mother's home had been listed for auction 3 days earlier, while I was in a funeral home choosing casket linings, by a real estate agency whose name I did not recognize, but whose phone number I was already saving into my phone with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. I sat in that car on Sycamore Drive, and I thought about Thomas's hand on my shoulder at the graveside 4 hours earlier, and Joanna's eyes wet with what I had understood as grief. And I understood now that the 2 people who had been holding me at my mother's funeral had already signed documents about the home we were burying her from, and had stood there and said nothing. I did not call Thomas. I did not call Joanna. I called someone else first. And what that person told me about the previous 3 days on Sycamore Drive is what I need you to hear before anything else. The person I called was Patricia Hendricks, my mother's neighbor for 22 years, and she answered on the first ring with the voice of someone who has been waiting for a call and is both relieved and heartbroken that it has finally come. She told me that Thomas had arrived at the house the morning after my mother passed, the very next day, with a woman Patricia did not recognize and 2 men carrying clipboards who walked through every room making notes, and that Joanna had come separately on Tuesday and left with 3 bags that Patricia described as large and heavy, and that a locksmith had arrived Tuesday afternoon and changed every lock on the house, which explained why my key had not worked when I had tried the door on Thursday morning before the funeral, and had simply assumed, because grief had taken all my available skepticism, that the lock was stiff from the cold. I thanked Patricia, ended the call, and then did something that I believe was the single smartest decision I made that entire day. Instead of calling my brother, I called the real estate agency directly, because I needed one specific piece of information before I spoke to anyone in my family. And that information was whether the sale had already been completed or whether it could still be stopped. The man who answered had the careful neutrality of someone trained to handle volatile conversations, and after confirming my name and my relationship to the property, he told me that the auction had been scheduled but had been postponed due to a complication, and when I pressed him on what complication, he said there was an open question about whether Thomas had the legal authority to list the property in the first place, because a solicitor had already contacted the agency on behalf of the estate and raised that exact issue. I sat with that information for the length of 3 slow breaths, because what it meant was that someone had already begun pulling on the thread before I had even found the sign. Someone who knew about the listing, knew about Thomas, and had the standing to challenge it. And I knew of only one person that could be, a woman whose name I had seen written in my mother's handwriting on an envelope on the kitchen table 2 years earlier that my mother had quickly covered with her hand and said was just paperwork. I found her number exactly where my mother had asked me to save it 3 years ago, when she had said quietly and without explanation, "Just in case, Maggie, you never know." And I called it, and she answered on the second ring, and she said my name like she had been expecting it, and she said those words that made the ground feel solid again for the first time since Sunday. "I think it is time we met, Miss Ellison. Your mother left something for you, and I believe you are going to want to see it today." The woman's name was Helen Carr, and she was a solicitor who had been handling my mother's private legal affairs for 2 years without any of us knowing. And she asked me to come to her office above the bookshop on Clemens Street that same afternoon. And when I walked up those narrow stairs and sat down across from her desk, I noticed that the office was exactly the kind of space my mother would have trusted. Small, ordered, full of natural light, with none of the performative formality that makes people feel like they are being processed rather than heard. Helen did not waste time with preamble. She placed a sealed envelope on the desk in front of me with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting. And I want you to understand what it means to see your mother's handwriting 3 hours after you have buried her. It is not like seeing a photograph. It is more immediate than that, more physical, because handwriting carries the specific pressure of a specific hand, and my mother's hand had formed those letters, and that hand was gone now, and the letters were still here. And I sat with that envelope for a long moment before I opened it because I needed one more second of not yet knowing, one more second of my mother still having something left to give me that I had not received yet. Inside the envelope was a letter and a document, and the letter was 3 pages long and written in the same careful, unhurried voice my mother had used for everything she considered worth saying properly, the voice I had grown up hearing at the kitchen table when she explained something she wanted me to understand completely rather than just partially. The letter told me that 2 years earlier, when her health had first begun to shift in ways she had chosen not to share with any of us because she did not want to become a problem to be managed before she was ready, she had made a decision about the house on Sycamore Drive that she had kept entirely to herself. And she had kept it to herself not out of secrecy, but out of the specific wisdom of a woman who had raised 3 children and understood each of them well enough to know that transparency in this particular matter would have invited exactly the kind of interference she did not have the energy to manage while she was also trying to stay alive. She had watched Thomas for years, she wrote, and she loved him, but she knew what Thomas did with things he considered assets. He calculated them. And the house on Sycamore Drive was not an asset. It was a history, and histories do not survive being calculated. The document beneath the letter was a deed of transfer, legally executed and witnessed and registered with the land registry 18 months before she passed, transferring full and sole ownership of the house on Sycamore Drive into my name, not Thomas's, not Joanna's, mine. And the letter explained without apology and without excessive sentiment that she had made this decision because I was the one who had shown up, not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently, in the way that matters most, in every ordinary Tuesday before the extraordinary ones, and she wanted the house to belong to someone who understood what it had cost her to build it and what it would cost to keep it, and who would pay that cost willingly because they understood its value was not financial. Helen Carr had filed a legal challenge to the agency listing the moment Thomas had approached them because my mother had left her with precise instructions to do exactly that if anyone attempted to sell or transfer the property without my knowledge or consent. And the challenge had been filed within hours of the agency receiving Thomas's paperwork, which meant that the auction had been legally compromised before the sign had even been planted in the front yard. I called Thomas that evening from the kitchen of the house that was now legally mine, and I told him everything I knew and everything the document said, and he was silent for so long I counted to 14 before he spoke, and when he did, all he said was, "She never told us." And I said, "No, Thomas, she told me." And I ended the call and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden my mother had tended for 31 years. And I made her a promise that it would be tended for 31 more.